Well, as we've noted before, either at the end of 1895 or the beginning of 1896, Ellen White wrote a letter to Pastor Baker and his wife, who were serving in Tasmania at the time. And in this letter, there were some statements made on Christology that have been taken as a license by some of the newer theology people in the church to reinterpret hundreds of statements of Ellen White's to say something that they really didn't say. And so we want to look at some of this letter today and understand a little bit more about how we can understand the Baker letter and put it in the proper perspective better. Now, before we go into the Baker letter, I want to look at something from the Bible that I hope will help us. If we go to the second slide, we have here Revelation chapter 14 and verse 11. And I'll read that for you. Revelation 14:11. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. And they have no rest, day nor night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name. Pretty strong statement. If we would continue now to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 10 in the next slide. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 10. And the devil that deceiveth them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. But that's not all. Continuing in Isaiah 66, verses 22 and 23. For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And we quote that text, and we talk about the new earth, right? But notice what comes out in the same context of that in the very next verse, in verse 24. And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, for their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. Oh, interesting text, isn't it? In connection with that, Jesus said in Mark chapter 9, verse 44, in our next slide, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. But you know what? We're still not done. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 23, Paul says, for I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Now, friends, if these were the only Bible verses that we ever read on the destiny of the wicked and on maybe on the state of the dead, we probably would come to some different conclusions than we probably all hold today at this very moment. And I'm basing that statement on about 5 different statements. 5 different statements of Scripture. And you say, well, but Alan, that's not really the whole picture, right? There's much more involved than just that. And there are other statements that are complementary. These are not contradictory, they are complementary, which help us to understand these in the proper light. And I say, yes, that's right. But what we have done, and when I say we, I should be more specific, what certain theologians have done within Adventism is not take 5 or 6 statements of Ellen White, but they have taken one statement of Ellen White, and they've tried to reinterpret and reestablish a position based upon one statement that seems to go against the grain of literally hundreds of other statements. Now, I mentioned that Ellen White wrote this letter to Pastor W.L.H. Baker, who was in Tasmania at the time, and it's a long letter. It's a 48-paragraph letter. And it begins with motherly tones, if you please. She's writing to Baker, and he's discouraged, and she says, if you just win one soul, God will not count your work a failure. But in this 48-paragraph letter, 6 of the paragraphs deal with the subject of Christology, or the nature of Christ. And I want to go through all 6 of those paragraphs. We're going to read all 6 of them first. You can't say we're not looking at the whole picture here. And then we're going to discuss some about the background, the context, and the history of them. The first one is in this letter. It's called Letter 8 of 1895 here, but it's actually dated when you look at it, it's dated in February of 1896. So that's why we say it's either the beginning of 1896 or the end of 1895. But the Christology part begins on paragraph 14. And this is really the big paragraph that causes most of the concern. And we don't know exactly all that Baker was teaching. We don't have a record of what he was actually saying on Christology. But whatever he's saying, Ellen White is having to tempering him. She's putting a temper to him because he's on an extreme position, whatever it is. She says, be careful, exceedingly careful as to how you dwell upon the human nature of Christ. Do not set him before the people as a man with the propensities of sin. He is the second Adam. The first Adam was created a pure, sinless being without a taint of sin upon him. He was in the image of God. He could fall, and he did fall through transgressing, because of sin. His prosperity was born with inherent propensities of disobedience. But Jesus Christ was the only begotten Son of God. He took upon himself human nature and was tempted in all points as human nature is tempted. He could have sinned, he could have fallen, but not for one moment was there in him an evil propensity. He was assailed with temptations in the wilderness, as Adam was assailed with temptations in Eden. And those of us who were here when we were discussing the subject, was Christ tempted in all points as we are? In the second part of that study, we were talking about passions and propensities. And there we saw that Ellen White used these terms in different ways. She spoke about natural propensities that we all have because of the way we are. And she spoke about evil propensities. And Christ never had, she said, an evil propensity. You notice here in this paragraph, near the end of the paragraph, third line from the bottom as we see it on the slide, she says there was never in him an evil propensity. Now, prior to this, she says that that we are not to set him before the people as a man with the propensities of sin. Of sin. Not to sin, but of sin. And so when we put this in light of how Ellen White uses the term propensities and under different categories, we see that it doesn't really necessarily mean that Christ was born with something that we don't have, that we're not born with. That's not what it's saying. Now, before I go to the next paragraph in this section, paragraph 15 of the letter, I just want to share something that just came to my desk literally this morning. And it was something that Marshall Grossball, some of you have heard of John Grossball, but maybe a few of you have heard of Marshall Grossball. Marshall was John's brother and probably a far exceedingly greater preacher in many respects, not to deter John or say anything negative about him. Marshall, as many of you know, was killed in a plane crash several years ago, he and his family. But in the first issue of a publication that was being started by Ron Spear called the Second Advent Herald, on pages 11 and 12, Marshall Grossball wrote this. He says, many have made much out of the statement of Ellen White in a private letter to an elder Baker that Christ had no propensities for sin. This, in context, was referring to his character. Within the very statement, she explains that he had no propensities for sin because he never yielded to temptation. This is the same purity that we can have. Ellen White gives the same assurance to us. We too need not retain one sinful propensity. And we read that statement last week as well. So that was just a summation of how Marshall Grossball understood that statement, how he would present it. But going to the next paragraph in the statement so that we can get it all together, paragraph 15. Again, this is letter 8 of 1895. Ellen White's writing, and she says, Brother Baker, avoid every question in relation to the humanity of Christ which is liable to be misunderstood. Truth lies close to the track of presumption. In treating upon the humanity of Christ, you need to guard strenuously every assertion, lest your words be taken to mean more than they apply, and thus you lose or dim the clear perceptions of his humanity as combined with divinity. Let me just pause for a second. You remember Ellen White, she cautioned A.T. Jones. She says, you're stating certain things in ways that will be misunderstood. She says, I know what you mean, but others will misunderstand you. And that's what she's saying here to Baker. And in fact, she says, you better be careful. People will not understand you. They'll take things and they'll make it something that it's not. And of course, that's exactly what has been done. Continuing, she says, his birth was a miracle of God, for, said the angel, behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God should give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Then said Mary unto the angel, how shall this be, seeing I know not a man? And the angel answered and said unto her, the Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. And that's taken from Luke 1, verses 31 through 35. Then continuing in the next paragraph. These words do not refer to any human being except to the Son of the infinite God. Never in any way leave the slightest impression upon human minds that a taint of or inclination to corruption rested upon Christ, or that he in any way yielded to corruption. And of course, we've never said that. We have never taught that. People who truly understand the incarnation, historic Adventists who understand the incarnation, have never taught that. That's not what we teach. And she says, don't do that. Continuing, she says, he was tempted in all points like as man is tempted, yet he is called that holy thing. Verse 35, referring back to Luke 1. It is a mystery that is left unexplained to mortals, that Christ could be tempted in all points like as we are, and yet be without sin. The incarnation of Christ has ever been, and will ever remain, a mystery. That which is revealed is for us and for our children, but let every human being be warned from the ground of making Christ altogether human, such an one as ourselves, for it cannot be. The exact time when humanity blended with divinity is not necessary for us to know. We are to keep our feet on the rock, Jesus Christ as God revealed in humanity. And as we look at this statement, she says that let us be warned from the ground of making Christ altogether human. In other words, every one of us, we are, all of us, altogether human. But we can partake of the divine nature, correct? But Christ, when he became incarnate, was also of the divine nature already. He was the God-man. He was the man Christ Jesus, but he was also the Son of God at the same time. She speaks about humanity and divinity being blended. And that we don't need to know the exact time that that happened. The next paragraph, paragraph 18. She says, I perceive that there is danger in approaching subjects which dwell on the humanity of the Son of the infinite God. He did humble himself when he saw he was in fashion as a man, that he might understand the force of all temptations wherewith man is beset. So whatever Ellen White's saying, she is not saying that Christ didn't understand all the temptations that we have. Okay? Make that clear. And, you know, Ellen White, in one place, she says, if we want a deep study, she says, let us study the most marvelous thing that ever happened in heaven and earth, the incarnation of the Son of God. But she says, in that study, she says, there can be danger, and you better be careful in how you approach it. And then in paragraph 19, she said, the first Adam fell, the second Adam held fast to God and his word under the most trying circumstances, and his faith in his Father's goodness, mercy, and love did not waver for one moment. It is written, was his weapon of resistance, and it is the sword of the Spirit which every human being is to use. Hereafter I will not talk much with you, for the prince of this world cometh and hath nothing in me, nothing to respond to temptation. John 14:30. On not one occasion was there a response to his manifold temptations. Not once did Christ step on Satan's ground to give him any advantage. Satan found nothing in him to encourage his advances. And those are the paragraphs in the Baker letter that deal with the incarnation and the topic of Christology. Now, there's a principle that Ellen White laid out for us that I want to share with you. And she wrote this in volume 5 of the Testimonies. It's found on page 696 and paragraph 1. She says, if you desire to know what the Lord has revealed through her, referring to herself, Sister White, read her published works. Read her published works. Now, today that has a little different fitting than it did when she wrote this in the Times of Volume 5. Because today, everything that Ellen White ever wrote has now been published, right? Everything. It's all been opened up. But it wasn't like that at one time. There were a lot of personal letters she wrote, and maybe she herself never intended that they all be ever published. We don't know her intentions for every single letter. We know she made provisions for things to be published in the future after her death. But whether she thought that it was a good idea that everything eventually be published, probably not. Maybe she wrote personal things to people that didn't need to be exposed. But of course, through time, people have died on, and I suppose it's been considered okay. But she says if we want to know what she really believes and what she's teaching, read her published works. Now, the Baker letter she wrote, as we said, in the latter part of 1895 or the early part of 1896. It was never, ever published during her lifetime. This letter was never brought out, or any portions of it, until the time of Questions on Doctrine. And that should be interesting to know. Now I want to read to you a couple pages and notice some material from a book that was published several years ago by Elder Ralph Larson entitled The Word Was Made Flesh. The Word was made flesh. In fact, I have a copy of it here. It says it's 100 years of Seventh-day Adventist Christology from 1852 to 1952. So he's covering basically the time from the forming of the church until just before the book Questions on Doctrine came out. And what he proposes in this book is that there was a clear, consistent, unified position on the incarnation for 100 years. And it wasn't until Questions on Doctrine was published that there was ever a deviation from that. And this manuscript was prepared, and I'll give you the date on it. I don't remember. I'm thinking it was, maybe it's not dated. Here it should be dated. Yes, 1986. 1986. So how far back does that go? It goes back 35 years. 35 years ago. Well, there were no computer databases 35 years ago. So the fact that he's got a book this thick with hundreds and hundreds of statements of Ellen White, as well as statements from the pioneers, took a tremendous amount of research. I mean, I think he was over a year in researching this book and finding these various statements. You'd had to have a good breadth understanding of the spirit of prophecy to have done that. And he shows how that Ellen White and the pioneers, people like E.J. Waggoner, J.H. Waggoner, A.T. Jones, and others, wrote consistently on the incarnation. And that the Baker letter seems to be really the only exception, and I say seems, because of the way it's been misconstrued and presented by other people. But I want to share with you, and I actually have photocopies of some of these pages 29 through 31. These are portions of pages. And we're going to just read through these and notice what Ralph Larson's comments are about the Baker letter here. And he says, this letter has been seized upon by certain interpreters of Ellen White's writings and used as the guiding principle as interpreted, to which all of her other Christological statements in books, magazine articles, or other private letters must be subordinated. Let me just stop there. In other words, he's saying that they take this one statement, this one fundamental paragraph, a portion of this one fundamental paragraph, and they use that as a basis to make everything else she said subordinate. It would be like me taking Revelation 14:11 and using it as a club to destroy every Bible verse that speaks about the annihilation of the wicked, including John 3:16. Right? Because John 3:16 says that we can have everlasting life so that we need not perish, because the wicked are going to perish. He says, the steps in logic being followed by her interpreters seem to be these. And so here are the steps of logic that he's saying that these people who are falsely using this statement do. Ellen White wrote to Baker that Christ did not have an evil propensity. By this, she really meant to say that Christ did not have natural propensities such as fallen men have. And remember last week we talked about these different kinds of propensities. Some that had to be controlled, some that had to be eliminated. Natural propensities were propensities that had to be controlled. Evil propensities were those kind that had to be eliminated. Crucified. In fact, she says crucified. 3. If he did not have the natural propensities that fallen men have, it follows that he could not have had the same human nature that fallen men have. Point 4. Therefore, Ellen White is actually trying to say to Baker that Christ had come to the earth in the human nature of the unfallen Adam. Having established this to their satisfaction, from their interpretation of her letter, they do not permit themselves to be disturbed by the fact that Ellen White nowhere wrote that Christ came to the earth in the nature of unfallen Adam, nor yet by the fact that she often wrote that Christ came to the earth in the human nature of fallen man. We must remember that Ellen White had no formal education beyond the 3rd grade and no theological training at all, they seem to be saying. We should not, therefore, expect too much of her, but we should generously assist her to say what we realize that she really meant to say, but somehow was not able to express correctly in her own words they imply. As her interpreters, they generously assist her by explaining to the world that when she wrote that Christ endured the same temptations that Adam endured, she really meant to say that Christ had the same human nature that the unfallen Adam had. That when she wrote of the sinlessness of the human nature of Christ, she really meant to say sinless human nature of Christ. That when she wrote that Christ had come to earth in the human nature of fallen man, she really meant to say that only his physical nature was like that of fallen man. And that when she wrote that Christ took upon himself all the infirmities, all the liabilities, all the weaknesses, and all the susceptibilities of fallen human nature, she really meant to say that he did this vicariously, not actually. They remind their readers often that Christ's incarnation is a great mystery. Now you see that word vicariously there. It's italicized, isn't it? Where did we see that last session that we were studying in this? From the book Questions on Doctrine. They said that all of these susceptibilities and liabilities and weaknesses he accepted vicariously and not in reality. And that the fallenness of the fallen nature, whenever that term is used, simply only refers to the physical nature of Christ. In other words, he could get sick, he could get tired, he could get hungry just like a human being can. But if you remember when we were talking about the Holy Flesh movement, that this was one of the central points of the Holy Flesh movement. And that Holy Flesh movement, Ellen White said there was not a thread of truth in the entire fabric. Not a thread of truth in the entire fabric. Going on to the next portion, Larson states, having thus generously assisted her, interesting way of expressing it, generously assisting her to say what they must have thought she meant to say, but seemingly could not find the words to express correctly, they, her interpreters, can now fervently applaud the remarkable wisdom of her intentions in expressions like these. And now notice it's a quotation, and this quotation comes from Leroy Froome's book, Movement of Destiny, pages 494 and 495. They speak about sublime in scope, penetration, comprehensiveness, balance, dependability. No other writer in our ranks has ever approached it in coverage. Her declarations are refreshingly clear. Nothing to be ashamed of, everything to be proud of, priceless, remarkable, terse, comprehensive, etc., etc. Well, I would agree that that is the way her writings are. But they didn't really believe that, because they had to take this one statement and reinterpret everything else based upon it, because they were ashamed. Because there was something in their mind that they could not be proud of. Larson continues, we may be pardoned for wondering who most fully deserves these accolades of praise. Ellen White, who apparently was not able to say what she wanted to say, or her interpreters who so generously assisted her. Whether interpreters are actually applauding Ellen White or applauding themselves would seem to be a fair question. It will be necessary, therefore, for us to move forward in our investigation while holding certain questions in our mind. Maybe it be possible, after all, that Ellen White meant what she wrote and wrote what she meant. Continuing, do we find any statement, in her own words, that Christ came to earth in the human nature of the unfallen Adam? If not, how can we be sure that this is what she actually believed? Do we find any statement, in her own words, that Christ assumed only the physical nature of fallen man in his incarnation? Do we find in her own words any statement that Christ assumed the weaknesses, liabilities, and susceptibilities of fallen human nature vicariously, but not actually? Do we find any corrective letter written by Ellen White to the many prominent church leaders who were teaching that Christ had come to the earth in the nature of fallen man? Why would she correct Baker and not correct the others? Do we find any change between the earlier and latter statements of Ellen White regarding the humanity of Jesus? Do we find any other area in which Ellen White so desperately needed the assistance of interpreters in order to say what she was trying to say? With these questions in mind, let us turn to the records of history. And at this point, Larson delineates hundreds of statements that were given by the early pioneers up to around the time of 1895 on the Incarnation. I'm only going to read a few of them, and I've got them dated here, and I've only taken the statements from Ellen White. But there are many statements that can be documented from the pioneers as well. One statement, this is from Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, page 25.1, written though, published in 1858. Jesus told them, referring to the angels, that they should have a part to act, to be with him, and at different times strengthen him, that he should take man's fallen nature, and his strength would not even be equal with theirs. In 1858, Ellen White says that he would take man's fallen nature. Our next statement, 1864. But I don't have time to be exhaustive. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4A, page 115.3, written in 1864. It was in the order of God that Christ should take upon himself the form and nature of fallen man, that he might be made perfect through suffering and endure himself to the strength of Satan's temptations, that he might the better know how to succor those who should be tempted. Notice she speaks about him taking not only the form, but also the nature of fallen man. She did not equate these to be the same thing. Okay, so when we read about her saying that Jesus took the nature of fallen man, it's not just simply the form and nature. The next statement is in 1872 that I'll have from the Review and Herald, December 31, paragraph 19. It was in the order of God that Christ should take upon himself the form and nature of fallen man. Now notice this is very similar to what we just read. And probably the statement prior that we read in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4A, is the source of this, but it's slightly different. But notice, it was in the order of God that Christ should take upon himself the form and nature of fallen man, that he might be made perfect through suffering, and himself endure the strength of Satan's fierce temptations, that he might understand how to succor those who should be tempted. Again, almost the same thing word for word, slightly different. But the point I'm making is that the theology didn't change. The theology didn't change. And then 2 years later, in 1874, in the Review and Herald, August 4, 1874, paragraph 6. The humanity of Christ reaches to the very depths of human wretchedness and identified itself with the weaknesses and necessities of fallen man, while his divine nature grasped the eternal. 5 years later, more, 1879. Signs of the Times, January 30, 1879, paragraph 7. When the plan of salvation was revealed, Satan rejoiced with his angels that he could, by causing man's fall, pull down the Son of God from his exalted position. He told his angels that when Jesus should take fallen man's nature, he could overpower him and hinder the accomplishment of the plan. Satan knew the nature that Jesus was going to take. 1881, Review and Herald of October 11th, 1881, paragraph 1. Christ took upon himself our infirmities, and in the weakness of humanity, he needed to seek strength from his Father. She doesn't say that he took these infirmities and weaknesses vicariously. No, he took them in actuality, in reality, because he had to seek strength from his Father in overcoming them, so that we overcome just as he overcame. 1885, the Review and Herald of February 10. Jesus, who took upon himself the infirmities and bore the griefs and sorrows of humanity and conquered on our behalf, he was made like unto his brethren with the same susceptibilities, mental and physical. He was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin, and he knows how to succor those who are tempted. How does he know? How does he really know? Because he experienced the things that we experience. He experienced temptations from without, and he experienced temptations from within. He knew what the struggles of men were. going to the year 1891. Review and Herald of January 21, 1891, paragraph 10. He humbled himself that he might meet fallen men where they were, and through the influence of a sanctified humanity, educate them and reveal to them himself as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. 1894. The Youth's Instructor of August 23, paragraph 1. Let children bear in mind that the child Jesus had taken upon himself human nature and was in the likeness of sinful flesh, and was tempted of Satan as all children are tempted. He was able to resist the temptations of Satan through his dependence upon the divine power of his heavenly Father, as he was subject to his will and obedient to all his commands. Jesus did not overcome sin in his own divine strength, because he had to overcome as we have to overcome. And we have to overcome in fallen sinful flesh. He had to overcome in fallen sinful flesh. We have to depend upon the power of God to overcome. He had to depend upon the power of God to overcome. Now this brings us down to the time just before the Baker letter is written. So all this backlog and literally hundreds of other statements are behind us historically on the timeline. And how many of these statements Brother Baker would have had access to or would have read, we can't know, we don't know. But there was a vast amount of material here, and certainly he would have had opportunity to have seen some of this. Now, in the next slide, I just make a note that the years of 1895 and 1896 were ripe with studies on the Incarnation, especially men like A.T. Jones and W.W. Prescott. I read to you part of a statement a few weeks ago from A.T. Jones in the 1895 General Conference session. He spoke extensively on the Incarnation. About this time, Prescott was in Australia and he was preaching. And he preached a series on the nature of Christ. And he spoke about Christ taking the fallen nature of man. These things can be all documented. I can give you the resources. I just can't read them all. We don't have the time to read them all now. But Ellen White spoke so positively and glowingly about Elder Prescott's sermons and what a blessing they were. But neither Jones, Prescott, others, nor Ellen White ever taught that Jesus came in the nature of Adam before the fall. Now I want to read you just a few more paragraphs from Larson's book on the immediate context of the Baker letter, and this is from his book, The Word Was Made Flesh, pages 66 and 67. Even though this book was published about 35 years ago, you should still be able to find it on the internet. I think it is available. Here we go, page 66. He says, in order that the Baker letter may be viewed as clearly as possible within the setting of its own immediate context, we are focusing our attention in this section on the 2-year period 1895 through 1896. It was near or shortly after the end of the year 1895 that Ellen White wrote a letter from Australia to a pastor, W.L.H. Baker in Tasmania, a letter which was to be used by others after her death to change the Christological position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It is apparent from the records that this 24-month period, 1895 through 1896, constituted a high water mark in Christological discussions within the Seventh-day Adventist Church and in its testimony to the world. We have just noted, and when he says we have just noted, he had a section dealing with statements from 1895 through 1896, many of them coming from the Bible Echo that was published in Australia at that time, which certainly Baker would have had access to. He says, we have just noted that in the 1895 through 1896, the Australian Bible Echo had published the opinion that Christ had come to the earth in the human nature of fallen man or sinful flesh in 2 statements by Ellen White, 2 front-page editorials, a statement by A.T. Jones, a statement by W.W. Prescott, and a full text of a sermon by Prescott in which he affirmed that opinion 25 times, while twice rejecting the view that Christ had come to earth in the human nature of the unfallen Adam. That was what was being presented to Baker and to the others in the Australian field at that time. Larson goes on. He says, meanwhile, the same subject was being given extended treatment elsewhere. In January 1895, a statement by William Culvert and another by J.H. Derlin were published in the Review. In February, church delegates gathered for a general conference session in the Battle Creek Tabernacle in Battle Creek, Michigan. Here they listened to a series of messages by W.W. Prescott, during which he stated at least 20 times that Christ had come to earth in the fallen nature, sinful flesh of man. This conviction was shared and reinforced by A.T. Jones, who in a series of talks on the third angel's message made the same point not less than 90 times. It is worth noting that Jones used several lines from an advanced manuscript of Ellen White's yet unpublished The Desire of Ages to support his statements about the nature of Christ, and we read some of those very statements a few weeks ago. These messages were taken down by stenographers and were reported in full to the church membership in the General Conference Bulletin. During the ensuing months of 1895, several additional statements by Prescott, Starbuck, and Derlin were published in the Review and in the Signs. Ellen White could not have come to the end of the year 1895 when she wrote the Baker letter without being aware of these events. And when W.W. Prescott brought the same message with strong emphasis to the Armadale camp meeting in Australia in October/November 1895, the record is clear that she rejoiced to hear it and commended it in unmistakable terms, and I made reference to that a few minutes ago. She herself had been expressing the same thought in letters and manuscripts throughout the year, as well as in the manuscript for The Desire of Ages, which she was preparing for publication. In 1896, along with 20 statements of Ellen White and several by J.E. Evans, Stephen Haskell, etc., the Review published a series of articles by W.W. Prescott in which he restated his conviction about the human nature of Christ at least 25 times. So, the combined testimony of the various spokesmen for the church, including Ellen White, during this 2-year period of 1895 through 1896 could not have been less than 250 statements that our Lord came to this earth in the human nature of fallen man. And those are the statements that Larson was able to find. It doesn't mean that there were not more. He says that's the minimum number we have. And again, remember, he's doing this research before there were computer databases on all this. Speaking in terms of chronology, we would see these 2 years, with their strong emphasis on Christological discussions, as the immediate context of the Baker letter. We cannot state with certainty how much of this discussion came to the attention of W. L. H. Baker, but we cannot doubt that most, if not all of it, was made known to Ellen White, and it would seem highly unlikely that Baker could have missed it all. Now, we could go on, and we could show statements from 1896, 1897, to 1915, when Ellen White died, and then from 1916 to 1952, where there are statements by the leading ministers of the church stating these very same things. The research is there. It's available to all of us today. I don't need to take time to read all those statements, but I can tell you this: you will not find statements during that time, and especially never a statement by Ellen White, where she said that Jesus accepted the unfallen nature of Adam, or the nature of Adam before his fall. You'll never find her stating anything ever like that. You will never find Ellen White saying that Jesus didn't understand all of our temptations. You will never find Ellen White making a statement that Jesus was not in all points tempted like as we are without sin. We cannot let a misinterpretation of fundamentally one paragraph of one letter, we cannot allow that to cause us to reinterpret hundreds of Ellen White statements and hundreds of statements from the denomination and the people who God was using and blessing at that time to redefine what truth is. Because when we do that, friends, we end up in all kinds of problems. It will start a snowballing effect of creating other problems, other doctrinal issues that cannot be righted with the Bible nor Ellen White's writings. And so my encouragement to you is to read the Baker letter, to read it all in its context. You don't have to be afraid of it, but just remember how Ellen White used the terms passions and propensities in two different ways. There were some passions and propensities which were to be controlled, just like appetite. She spoke of appetite. Appetite had to be controlled. There's nothing wrong with appetite of itself. But there were other types of passions and propensities that she said had to be crucified, had to be set aside, laid aside, put away, because they were evil. And they came from evil and led to evil of themselves. And so putting all this in context into the Baker letter and allowing her other writings to interpret the one text instead of the one text to interpret all the others, we find Ellen White being very consistent. We don't find the Baker letter to be something that is contradictory to the rest of her writings. We find it to be something that is complementary. And I just pray that you will be able to do that too. It has caused me to have no less confidence in the gift of the prophetess, not one bit. And it shouldn't cause you to have any less confidence either. No more than Revelation 14:11, Isaiah 66:24, or Philippians 1:23 causes you to have any less concern about inspiration of the Bible. Now, if I was writing the Bible, would have I written Revelation 14:11 exactly like it is? Probably not. Would have I written Philippians 1:23 like it is? Probably not. And that's one reason God didn't tell me to write the Bible, because I wouldn't listen clear enough probably. But God had a reason for putting those texts in just like He did. And so I would submit to you that God had a reason for allowing Ellen White to write just as He wrote to Elder Baker, knowing that there could come a day when it could cause confusion, but knowing also that sometimes deadly heresy must come in among the people so that they will be driven to search the Scriptures to know what the truth is, so that we will not be misled by people who really don't put God first. My brothers and sisters, we are at the end of time. Things are wrapping up very fast. We are seeing things happen in our society, in the way people are being segregated, in the way that people are being cascaded, in ways we never expected it to happen. I'm not saying this is the final end of it all, but we know that things are if this is not the actual beginning of the end, that coming events are casting their shadows right now. If there was ever a time that we needed to be solid in our theology, it's now. Because you see, the concept of knowing God, knowing His character, knowing His personality, it's involved in knowing His Word. Because it's His Word that tells us what God is really like. We can have our own philosophical ideas, what God must be like, what Jesus had to be like in the Incarnation, or what He had not to be like in the Incarnation. But friends, those don't amount to anything except they have Scripture and inspiration to support them. And as we know from Ellen White's other writings, for instance, when she says that we are to accept the weight of evidence, on this issue, the weight of evidence is so overwhelming that it need not be misunderstood. And we need not be carried away with winds of doctrine, with a revival of this holy flesh teaching. May God give you the discernment you need, brethren, and bless you lots and lots and lots.